Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first author visit of the fall season. I'm your host, and I have a few housekeeping things to get out of the way. We have our restroom is at the rear of the room. Our exit, we will only be using the back exit from now until after the event, and I'll open up the other one. Our fall program brochures are out, so if you'd like to pick up one after the event, we have them available for you. The book sale for all previous authors' items are to the rear as well. And lastly, there will be a question and answer at the end, and that extends to our at-home viewers as well. All right, I will turn it over to our Michigan Notable Book Award nominee.
Thank you, Jerry. Well, first of all, many thanks for having Diane and I here tonight to the Willard Library. And it is so wonderful to look out in this room and see the faces of so many old, good, old I mean for the length of time that we've known one another, good friends. I'm always humbled first that some of you may have spent your hard-earned money to buy one of my books. And second, that you may have taken the time to read it. I've been writing in earnest for the last 10 years. I'm a novelist. And I enjoy creating characters, settings, and plots portraying the lives of our nation's greatest and frequently most unsung heroes. I'm speaking of our veterans of military service. I'm also a bit of a lunatic, so I frequently spin my stories around a love affair. I cherish the time I spend in front of the computer writing, but I also enjoy these opportunities to talk about what I've written or why I've written it. But talking about my writing is a bit different than just writing itself. A fellow writer, Dennis Roth, sums it up well, I think. He says, if it takes a lot of words to say what you have in mind, then give it more thought. So after giving my remarks a lot of thought, my effort tonight is to be both informative and brief, because I want to have time at the end to answer your questions. This is the story. This is the story of John A. Dix. When in 1871, this vessel was a marvel of shipbuilding technology. And only 175 feet in length and 28 feet at the boom, the steam generated the power to drive the huge paddle wheel that you can see, and that sits just about midships. She carried a mixture of cargo and passengers, but on the early morning of May 13, 1871, the Dix was steaming between Point Betsy, near Frankfurt, and Manistee, Michigan. And it was just as dark was transitioning to daylight, and it's that time of day I'm talking about when unrecognizable shapes suddenly start to reveal themselves for what they truly are. The crew of the Dix, thinking they were at least 2 miles off the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, suddenly found they had somehow wandered into a dense forest of maples, beech, oak, and hemlock trees. Dumbfounded, the captain ordered the engine room to come to full stop. They slowed, they confirmed their course, they were where they should be, but What the hell? The bow of the ship, its forward movement ever slowing, collided with these behemoths, and instead of the ship being dashed about, the giant trees would lower slowly from one side of the ship or the other. With a smaller life, the quicker logic, the trees weren't rooted, but the captain still filled the stout lungs of all of them could find his water wheel. Somehow he had to navigate out of this, whatever this might be. He had no idea. How did these get here? In that moment, he must have asked himself this question many times, but he couldn't even begin to speculate. All he knew for sure is, I have to get my ship out of here. Now out in the water, surrounded by trees, he ordered the engine room to slowly bring the ship back to life. And as the boats began to move again, he turned from a southerly one toward Manistee to a westerly one toward Wisconsin. His thought, this forest surely can't stretch that far. And he reasoned correctly. To the relief of everyone on board, they managed to break free of their leafy Lake Michigan prison. And a few years later, safely back to port in Manistee, the Dix's master reported to a skeptical port authority the trouble he'd encountered. A few years later, after the port authority corroborated the captain's implausible story, a warning to mariners was issued, and the revised vessels transiting along the eastern shore of Lake Michigan between the Point Betsy and Manistee lighthouses be watchful of floating debris. But debris could stretch as far as 2 to 3 miles offshore. And that warning would remain in full effect for the rest of the year of 1871. So the major question became, how did the forest encountered by the Dix get there? Before I answer that question, let's take a look at this map that you got to look at the last time. One more time. There. Yeah. There. This is a plat map. It's an old plat map of Portage Lake and its surrounding area. So over here, this is all Lake Michigan, and this is a narrow isthmus of land right here, and this is Portage Lake. Now, for some perspective, the size of that lake today measures about 2,100 acres, and in 1871, Portage Lake was ringed by little 80-acre homesteads all the way around it. Many of these were given free to veterans of the Civil War for their service to the Union. And what I want to point out on this map is this small little squiggle right here. Squiggle, that's a very technical map term. That little squiggle represents Portage Creek. It's a shallow stream of water that was at the time the only natural outlet between Portage Lake and Lake Michigan. For reference, go back to this isthmus right here. And that isthmus blocked Portage Lake from Lake Michigan, with only little exception being that little squiggle right there. And the first real issues that the farmers and the lumbermen faced, I want to show you this. This contraption is called a Mueller saw. And it, at the time, was used to cut lumber, logs into lumber, and this is in 1871. In the most modern sawmills at the time, steam, a relatively new force in industry, was used to drive the saw's blade. And the blade is that vertical thing right there. In most modern lumber mills at the time, however, wire wheels were used to drive these motors. This is one right here. It looks pretty idyllic, doesn't it? But in 1871, Porter Company, out of Chicago, owned a sawmill similar to this one, located over Portage Creek, that little squiggle on the map. Now, Portage Creek, I showed it to you a moment ago, if left alone, was little more than a trickle of water and incapable of driving a water wheel of that size. So Porter Company built a dam over Portage Creek. And when that dam was closed, Portage Lake would rise anywhere from 10 to 14 feet above its normal level. So in the spring, when the lake thawed, and the mill began its operation, the flow of high water caused by the dam was regulated to provide sufficient force to drive a water wheel like that one. And that water wheel, in turn, drove that newly sawed blade. It was Porter and Company's dam, as the farmers referred to it, and the rising water level around Portage Lake that became a huge bone of contention between frazzled farmers and big lumber. I refer to the lumber industry as big lumber simply because in 1871 there was no business larger or more powerful than the lumber industry in northern Michigan in the years immediately following the Civil War. In 1871, Wemlinger, Michigan could boast, and this is a statistic that blew me away when I uncovered it. Wemlinger, Michigan could boast it had more millionaires per capita than any other city in the United States. Powerful lumber barons were used to doing whatever they wanted to, as long as it meant there would be more lumber brought to the marketplace. Lumber camps, like this one, were plentiful in northern Michigan in those days, and the men who worked out of these camps were rough and tumble. The work was hard, it was long, and you can see by this picture, it was dangerous. Just look at it and let your imagination run away with you if one of these guys fell off one of these logs. This is just a quick lesson on how they did it back then. Logs were cut in the winter when the ground was frozen. Sleds like this one were used to pull logs to mills, where those mills that were using steam could produce lumber year-round. Winter logs, however, reached mills by being rafted down rivers, which was difficult at best in the deep freeze of a northern Michigan winter. In the case of railroad-driven mills, milling operations didn't begin until the spring and continued through the fall until ice, snow, and below freezing temperatures shut them down. Now, you should also know that at the same time in history, northern Michigan's agricultural future was beginning to blossom. Ulysses Grant was president, and he and the state of Michigan collaborated to provide free land to veterans of the war. In 1870-1871, these vets now turned farmers whose homesteads roamed Portage Lake were about to prove worthy adversaries to big lumber. They were sick and tired of Porter Company's mill closing the floodgates at the mill's dam and flooding out 10 to 20 acres of their little 80-acre farms. Now, when I say sick and tired, I mean they were sick and tired. It is. This is a picture taken around 1870 of the floodplain encircling Portage Lake. This floodplain was created when Porter Company's mill would open the dam's floodgates in mid-April or early May and begin to use the lake's water to drive the water wheel. When they would do this, the lake's level would slowly drop back to its more normal level, and the result was this waterlogged, flood-plagued ring around the lake. And as the summer would go warmer, mosquitoes, flies, and all those neat little insects would breed in the stagnant waters standing on floodplains like this one. Farmers and their families suffered from what they called ague, which is an insect-borne malady, and it's very similar to malaria. So they were under a big number and their unsympathetic attitude toward what the farmers felt was clear encroachment on their rights. They took Porter & Company to court in 1870, and Circuit Court Judge George E. Ramsdale issues an injunction forbidding the damming of Portage Creek. Here's a picture of a good judge, and in my humble estimation, he's quite a hero. Back then, the rules regarding judges were, shall we say, less limiting. In addition to being a non-state county circuit court judge, he was also a businessman, a successful businessman, invested in the lumber industry himself. I'm sure he had lots of friends similarly invested. Yet he did the right thing and made a judgment against big lumber. So I would say, hey, the good guys won, right? Well, not exactly. Due to a technicality, the judge's injunction was never served. And Big Lumber did what all was done. In the early spring of 1871, Porter Company closed the dam's gates, and Portage Lake began to rise, along with the farmers' rage. And this is where the story really gets interesting. Somewhere around May 1st, 1871, 27 farmers band together, determined they were going to dig their own outlet between Portage Lake and Lake Michigan, a replacement stream, if you will, to replace the dammed up Portage Creek. Recall the narrow portion of the narrow isthmus isolating the two lakes from one another? Let me show you again. So this is the narrow isthmus right here. And right down here is about the narrowest portion of it. It's right here where the farmers decide that they're going to make their cut. And to begin with, they built a temporary bulwark right along here on the Portage Lake side to hold back the rising waters of Portage Lake while they dig their ditch. What you can't see on this map is that this entire isthmus is covered in a dense, thick, almost primordial forest. It might have looked something like that. And for your reference, there's a man standing right there. So that's what farmers had to dig through. It's so dense, they are able to use horse and oxen-drawn plows, and so the ditch has to be dug with picks, axes, and shovels. It's a mere 500 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 2 feet deep. It takes them 2 weeks. They work at night, half of them there one night, the other half the next, and so on. Why work at night? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First, remember what time of year it is. It's spring, and their farms are just waking up after a long winter. They want to be farmers by day, excavators by night. And the second reason they were digging at night is they were trying to hide what they were doing from the management and labor at Porter's Mill. It didn't work. They were constantly harassed by big lumber who knew full well what the farmers were up to. On May 13th, 1871, the undaunted farmers know they are close to being done. And so they decide, we're going to throw a party. And they have it at one of the homesteads near the cut. They celebrate late into the night and early into the next morning. And when it finally becomes time to pull down their temporary bulwark, men, women, and children all troop down to watch this happen. It's still dark. And the only illumination is lamps, and so they have to be close to the bulwark to see anything. Yeah, you see, you can see what's coming here. They're going to get down there close to see anything at all. There's 3 ramps that hold this bulwark in place, and the lake is so high at this point that the water is splashing over the top of it. No one recognizes the peril we're in. These weren't engineers, they were just farmers. That's what happened is the how many of the lines will be pulled from the face of the bulwark before it collapses. And it doesn't fall down until the 3rd log is pulled. Now then, well then all hell breaks loose. In a matter of about 1 minute, their little 4-foot wide, 2-foot deep ditch expands to 100 feet wide, 10 to 12 feet deep, behind a raging torrent of water that sweeps the entire forest in front of it out into Lake Michigan. 100-foot tall trees are swept, roots, dirt, and all 2 to 3 miles offshore. People are scrambling for their lives, trying to escape that mad torrent of water. It's a miracle. And this is another amazing statistic. In all of this, no one, not even the family who was actually pulled down the bulwark, was swept out into the lake with the forest. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how the channel between Portage Lake and Lake Michigan came to be. What's it look like today? I like that. That's the cut today. And this picture was taken just after the Corps of Engineers finished about a $20+ million renovation that replaced the seawalls on both sides of this channel. That's absolutely amazing. So what happened in the immediate aftermath of this historical event, when the farmers opened up the cut? Well, the first thing and the most important thing is it changed the economy of the entire area forever. Porter & Company's mill closed, but other steam-driven sawmills sprung up around Portage Lake. The channel made shipping of goods easier. It provided easy access to Portage Lake, whose protected waters allowed ships to lay at berth during storms. Here's a picture of a schooner at berth. And what I want to point out on this picture is this is lumber, all stacked up here. And down here, in the hall, the lumber stacked up down there. Now, the other thing I want to point out to you is, look at this little distance here between the water line and the top of the ground. Can you imagine being in the middle of Lake Michigan in one of its storms with a load like that? and a storm comes up? Not me. So you're the sailor, would you? Yeah, no thanks, right? Food and other crops that were starting to become more plentiful could be more easily loaded to the market in the protected waters of Portage Lake. And finally, the cut opened up the area for tourism. How many of you have been to Onekama, maybe out to the Portage Point Inn? Here's a picture of a steamer, and that steamer is likely coming from Chicago. It's loaded with tourists to the area looking to escape the heat of the city by coming to the Portage Point Inn, which opened in 1903. So everything I've covered up to this point is true. But the cut's fictional. One of the questions I'm always asked, where does the history end and the fiction begin? Well, I've got a really evasive answer for you. If I've done my job as a writer well, you shouldn't be able to tell. The fiction should be woven seamlessly throughout the history, and it should replicate the history of the era perfectly. Now, this next slide is just you're going to be marveled by my insight and intelligence. No, not that one. I don't have it up here. It was? Ah, there it is. Yeah. So, I know, you're just incredibly blown away by the insightfulness of this slide, right? Yeah, probably not. These are about as old as the hills. But let me just add that they're not listed in any particular order. In fact, I don't consider any of these three things to be more important than the other. In equal doses, each is essential to a well-written work of fiction. And if I, as a writer, fail to develop any of these well, the result will be a loss of interest by the reader. So what I try to do when I'm writing is to make sure that each of these three elements are mutually supportive of the others.
So there's a glimpse into what I consider as I am writing a novel. But let's come back specifically to the cut. And I would like to talk briefly about the time period in which the book is set. 1870 to 1871 is an incredibly important couple of years in Michigan's, and in particular, northern Michigan's history. Three major events happened in fewer than 18 months. First, women, for the first time, are admitted to what is now Michigan State University and the University of Michigan during the academic year spanning 1870 to 1871. Allow me to point out how progressive a move that was in the Victorian age. The suffrage movement was in its infancy in 1871. For perspective, please consider the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, the one that gives women the right to vote, wasn't even passed by Congress until 1919 and not ratified until 1920. So it took half a century in between women being admitted to our state universities and women getting the right to vote. Our state universities in 1870, 1871 were literally 50 years ahead of their time. The second event that happens in May of 1871 is the digging of the cut, and you already now know the history of that event. The third event occurs in October of 1871. The city of Manistee basically burns to the ground. Now, there's some things you should know about that event. We all know about the Great Fire of Chicago, Mrs. O'Leary's cow and all that. But did you know it was the same storm that caused her cow to kick over the lantern and set Chicago ablaze that also created the blazes that burnt Peshtigo, Wisconsin, Holland, Michigan, Manistee, Michigan, and finally Saginaw, Michigan, to the ground. So the plot of the cut is built around these three events. I've also been asked, why write a novel when the history itself is so powerful? There are a couple of reasons. First, I'm a novelist. That's what I write best. That's what I like to create. Characters, settings, and plots, all of that stirs my creative juices. And when I'm writing a book, those characters, they get into my head. They become a part of me. And I can't stop thinking about them until I finish writing the book. A second reason, I was a history major in college. And I recall my history textbooks being an absolute foolproof cure for insomnia. And finally, a wonderful lady by the name of Elspeth Barstow Cheney had already written a wonderful history of Onekama for its centennial year in 1971. It's called The Story of Portage. And I used it a lot in my research for my writing of the cut in 2021, the 150th anniversary of the cut. And when I was asked by the Onekama 150 committee to write something for Onekama's sesquicentennial year, I wanted to write something that would strike a different note with readers while still portraying the fascinating history of Onekama and Manistee County during the golden years of the lumber barons. Okay, there you have it. If you've read the book, I hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't read it yet, then I hope I've provided sufficient inspiration, aroused your curiosity sufficiently that you will want to read it. What I'd like to do now is to open it up to your questions. And let me preface this part of the evening with something I used to tell the great soldiers I was privileged to work with during my Army career. How about the subject of questions? It is simply this. The only dumb question is the one you don't take the opportunity to ask when given the chance to ask it. So with that, what are your questions?
I want to make a comment about
Please.
Portage Point. Isn't that crazy, looking at those people there with hats and suits on and a lot of clothes that come by a boat over there I'm thinking how times have changed.
What I didn't talk about in that slide is you saw the people standing on shore. So that steamer would come in, empty itself of about 300 passengers. They're going to be spending a week at Portage Point Inn. And the people standing on shore, well, those were the people that were just finishing their week at the Portage Point Inn, waiting to reload to go back to Chicago. The Portage Point Inn opened in 1903, and I'm happy to report that the Portage Point Inn is still going strong today. On a big, huge renovation, not finished yet, but well underway. And if you come to Diane's in my part of the state, you need to go visit the Portage Point Inn. It was designed by the same architects that designed the Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island. So when you see it, it looks like you're going to say, well, it's a mini Grand Hotel. And yes, it is by design.
You know, the Grand Hotel was built by the steamship companies as a destination. And was this part of that, do you know, or was that also? Because
Do you know what year the Grand opened up, TR?
it's around the turn of the century.
Yeah, so the Portage Point Inn opened in 1903. It was definitely opened after the Grand, but I think the success of the Grand contributed to the idea to build the Portage Point Inn where they built it. But let me tell you, that had the cut never been dug, it wouldn't have happened. Now, the interesting thing about all that, and this isn't a question, this is a little filler on the history. So from May of 1871 to 1892, the channel, the cut, was designated by the federal government as a safe harbor channel. The only problem with that was nobody put any money towards maintaining it. And if you let a channel on Lake Michigan go that long without doing anything to it, so by 1892, the cut was only about 3 to 4 feet deep. And it was not navigable by anything much bigger than a rowboat. So it wasn't a safe harbor channel anymore. But in 1892, a schooner by the name of the City of Toledo foundered in a storm about 2 miles off of Portage Lake. And all hands were lost. The ship sunk, and it was tragic. And a great hue and cry went up about how this would not ever have happened had that channel been maintained. In 1892, the federal government, with pressure from the Michigan legislature, put aside the money and the channel was restored. And since 1892, it's been maintained with this most recent renovation that I showed you on the slide. Diane and I were just out the channel the other day in our boat, and I'm pleased to say that in the middle of that channel, it's 16 feet of water underneath the boat. And that was about 14 more feet than I needed in my little dinghy that I was going out in. Yes?
I was just curious about the wagon I saw with the logs that were cut and were stacked on it. I just wondered what they did to tie that down, or it looked like there was nothing, no sort of ties there.
You got that pretty much right.
Wow, that's dangerous.
Yeah, it's, believe me, there was no such thing as OSHA in any of these logging camps. Lumberjacks were regularly injured. And I'm not talking about little cuts and bruises and scrapes. I'm talking about losses of arms, losses of legs, losses of life. It was an extremely dangerous business. And yeah, I mean, that picture, I don't know. So there's actually, in this picture, there's one sled. There's a second sled. And there, it looks to me like there's a third sled. But I don't know that this team of 6 horses, even though it's snow covered, that they could pull 3. So I'm thinking that third sled, and maybe even the second one, isn't hooked up to this first one. I don't know. But just think about that by itself. And like you say, if there's a rope lashing there anywhere, it escapes me. So very observant. Thank you for the question. Jan.
So you mentioned that Manistee was the spot for the most millionaires per capita at that time. So if the cut hadn't happened and the lumber industry would have been able to continue as they were,
Yeah.
Do you think that there is any, or had you had any comment from anybody in the Manistee area there wishing that that hadn't happened?
I've never heard anybody say, oh, gee, I wish the farmers wouldn't have done the cut. Because anybody that looks at it the least bit objectively sees how it transformed the economy of the entire area.
For the better.
For the better. But let's just theorize for a minute what would have happened. I think eventually the farmers would have found relief from the dam, because those water wheel driven sawmills were on their way out. Steam was the new force driving industry, and eventually old Skinflint Porter would have either scrapped that mill altogether, or he would have converted it to steam, thereby eliminating the requirement for a dam and the maintenance associated with that dam. But the cut forced that hand.
Is there still a Portage Creek?
There is still a wetland, but there's no visible stream bed or anything flowing through it. There's no houses built on it. I've not done it myself, but I'm told that there are concrete footers at various places back in there that are probably foundational to Porter Company's mill. But other than that, that northern end of that isthmus is, it's pretty hilly, lots of dunes, and it's developed into cottages. People have summer homes there. So, Lorraine.
I was just wondering if anybody, I guess I'm thinking today, it's our sad choices, but as they were cutting all these trees down, did they not say eventually there aren't going to be any trees to sustain our business? Did they do anything environmentally to?
There were a few forward thinkers. Alvin Price, the main male protagonist, and Lydia Cochran, the main female protagonist in the book, are ahead of their day. They're environmentalists. Alvin looks at these guys cutting trees and thinks, well, you're going to run out of trees one day. And Lydia goes to the Agricultural College of the state of Michigan. She majors in agriculture, and her major is forests and reforestation, because she knows that it's not an endless supply of trees in Michigan or any place else. And in the book, she becomes quite renowned for the work that she does in that regard. The fire that burnt these towns to the ground, the important thing about that is the awful way that they cut lumber back then led to those fires. The summer of 1871 was a drought summer. Very little rain. The way they cut these trees, lumberjack would skinny up to the top. He'd cut the top out. It would fall to the ground. And then on his way down, he would cut the boughs. And they would just leave the boughs and the top of the tree laying on the ground. They would cut the trunk of the tree as close to the ground as they could cut it. Then they would section it off, as you see there in that picture, and load it on sleds and move it to a mill or to a river to be rafted down to the mill. And they left all this debris lay. That storm was packing thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lightning bolts. And it was propelled by a 60+ mile an hour wind as it swept across the tip of Lake Michigan and on up into northern Michigan. And so these lightning strikes would set those boughs on fire because they were literally tinder. And then that fire would rage, the wind would pick the embers up, and literally the air was on fire. It swept into these milling towns, which is what Manistee, Holland, parts of Muskegon, Saginaw, Peshtigo, Wisconsin, they were all mill towns. Their basic economy was lumber, lumber, lumber. What gets stacked up outside of sawmills? Anybody got a guess? Sawdust. Tons and tons and tons of it. What happens to sawdust in a 60-mile-an-hour wind? Gets picked up into the air, and this air is filled with burning embers. So literally, in the fire that burnt all these towns to the ground, the air was on fire. Now the amazing statistic, again, nobody was killed when the cut broke out. One elderly gentleman in Manistee succumbed to the fire. His name lost to history. Tried to find it, couldn't. The guy at the Manistee County Historical Museum couldn't. All we could find out is one elderly gentleman perished in the fire. Everybody got out, and that fire just swept in on them before they really, so they literally escaped with the clothes on their back and nothing else. Jay.
I have one about your writing process. Are you a researcher, as in like you research and gather everything before you write, or you write as you find information?
My process for this book was a little bit different than the other four. The other four are novels, but they're more current. They're more mainstream with what's going on with the modern military. And what I did in those four novels was I picked a subject that is impacting active duty military, reserve, National Guard military, or military veterans. And then I spin a story around that. And the purpose of writing the book is to be a window for people who may not have ever served in the military or known anybody that served in the military, and they can look in that window and they can get a feel for what military service is like. But the book is also meant to be a window, or I'm sorry, a mirror for somebody that has served or is serving. And they can look in that mirror and they can see the value and the honor in what they are currently doing. The cut, and my process there is I just start writing. And I take those three things, character, setting, and plot, and I'm very conscious of those as I'm writing each chapter. And in each chapter, I try and develop the important characters more and more and more for the reader. I also try and put them in a setting that's well described for the reader. And then I also want to make sure that that chapter propels the plot forward more. The cut was a little bit different. So it's a little bit like writing a book about the Titanic. You know how that's going to end, right? So with the cut, I knew how it was going to end. It was going to end with the cut getting dug. But I wanted to make it memorable for you, the reader. I didn't want it to be a dry, boring history book. And so I created some, I think they're really well-developed characters. And there's about 8 or 9 of them in the book that by the time you are into chapter 9 or 10, you really start to have a feel for who these people are and how they're interacting together and why they're interacting that way. So Lydia Cochran, for example, this very prim and proper young woman who lives in Manistee, comes from a very prominent family. Her dad is a railroad engineer. I'm not talking about the guy that drives the train. I'm talking about the guy that designs the railroad beds and all of that. And he is clearly on the side of big lumber. He sees his future in northern Michigan being based on railroads being built to move lumber to logging mills. And he is dead solid set against his daughter, his lovely, beautiful high school graduate, just graduated from high school daughter, having anything to do with this dirt poor farmer, Alvin Price, who ekes out a living on this little 80-acre homestead with his mom and dad. Completely opposed to that. He's also completely opposed to her going to college. His logic is, why are they wasting seats on women? There must be dozens of men that want to get into this college. And she doesn't need to go to college. What does she need? She wants to study agriculture. What does she need to know about sticking a seed in the ground and letting something grow? I'm an engineer and I never went to college, for crying out loud. I mean, the guy is really the epitome of the Victorian male. But then I create Lydia's mother, Irene, and her sister, Lydia's aunt, Lillian. And these are two very strong, independent women who have their own views on what's right for Lydia. And it creates a really conflicting part in the plot.
Whenever you're involved in your writing, Jeff, do you ever get so involved that you call Diane by some of these names?
Not that bad, Judy, but literally, and I know you're all familiar with it, that time early in the morning when you've just woke up after 5 or 6 hours of sleep, you want to get some more sleep, but something gets into your mind and you can't get it out. And because you can't get it out, you stay awake and you think. That's what my characters do to me. They'll wake me up at about 2 o'clock in the morning.
Do you have a certain time of day you like to write? It just depends on what you're working on.
I'm better in the morning, so I go from about 8 to 1. On a good day of writing, I'll go from about 8 o'clock in the morning to about 1 o'clock. My key is, we have a border collie, her name is Sydney, and she's 14 years old, but some days I think she's like 2. She's very active. When she gets up from wherever she's laying, and usually it's right at kind of my feet, when she gets up, she'll walk around the desk and she'll sit down and she'll look up at me like,
Okay.
1 o'clock.
Yeah.
It's time for my walk.
Yeah.
So wrap it up, big guy. And then I get back to it the next day. Good question. Brenda.
I know when, you probably know James Patterson came here through the line.
Yes, yeah, I saw that.
It was interesting to hear he writes by hand. Do you write or do you type?
I started out that way.
Which way? Writing by
Writing
hand?
by hand on a legal pad.
Yeah.
And I quickly transitioned to using the computer and Word.
That would seem
And
easier.
yeah, oh my God. I look back on those brief few months when I was trying to write all this out longhand on a legal pad, and all I can ask myself is, why?
Yeah, I know. I don't understand why he would do it either.
You know, I had an 8th grade typing teacher by the name of Miss McDonald, and you know, you type. What is that one you type?
The quick brown fox.
The quick brown fox. Yes.
Yeah.
Over and over and over again. That's the best skill I ever learned. Almost as, it's not as valuable as reading, but it ranks right up there.
Yeah, it does.
And now I can't, I think about my books a lot. I will make myself a note so I don't forget what that thought was, especially when it's one of those thoughts that comes to you about 2 or 2:30 in the morning. I keep a pad of paper and a pencil next to the bed. But it's all done on the computer.
Another comment.
Please,
Anybody
Brenda,
else?
please.
One of my stepdaughters is homeschooling her 3 kids, and she uses historical novels all the time.
Yeah.
It's so much more interesting to learn. She hands them off to me. I mean, one of the most interesting was Paul Revere's Ride, told through the horse's eyes.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I read that and I thought, if I'd
Isn't
had
that
history, if I'd had history handed to me like that,
Exactly.
yeah.
So one of my most rewarding experiences with this book, at the beginning it was quite terrifying, but it turned out to be one of my most rewarding experiences. A good friend of mine read the book. He's a retired American history teacher. He took the book to the guy that replaced him in the classroom and said, Joe, you need to read this book. Well, Joe was an athlete when he was in high school, and Jerry was his coach. And Joe said, when your old coach tells you to read something, you're going to read it. So he said, I read the book. And he said, I think my 8th grade American history class needs to read this book at the end of the year. That American history class wraps up with the Civil War. And it wraps that up with the Reconstruction period. And 1870, 1871 is right in the middle of that.
Yeah.
So Joe bought 40 copies of my book. Yeah, I love Joe. But then he really did a great job with his kids. He let them read it in class. He gave them the time in class to read it. And then he invited me to come in and talk with the kids about the book. Now, I got to tell you, talking to you guys is one thing. Talking to a room full of 8th graders, that's a whole nother kettle of fish. But I can honestly, I probably talked to 125 kids that day. There's not a single kid that I could point to and say, you're in the 8th grade acting like that. They were all just really attentive. They asked really sharp questions. They were very intrigued about, what do you mean women couldn't vote? What do you mean women couldn't go to college? Really good questions.
Yeah, I'll see that my grandkids get this.
Great. Good, thank you.
Melanie's kids will read it.
Thank you. Little interesting sidebar about Brenda. One of our oldest and dearest friends, she's the one that introduced Diane and I to one another.
They still speak to me.
I call her the Angel Raphael. Yes, ma'am.
I really enjoyed your book.
Thank you.
I am a trained historian.
Oh.
And I just thought it was great. Mostly because, you know, we camped up at.
Is that Mary? Mary?
Yeah,
Mary. Yeah.
Anyway, we camped up at Orchard Beach and saw the sign about the fire. And we camped over in Wisconsin and saw the Prestige. Of course, there 1,600 people died over the
Yes.
same storm, wasn't it?
Yes.
And it burned Chicago down the same day.
Yes. All the same storm.
I know, and it's just mind-boggling, and then to find out, because, you know, after being up there, and I'm not gonna know where the cut is.
Yeah.
After being at Boston. Oh my God, I was just fascinated by it, it was wonderful.
If you're up and you come to Onekama, right in the middle of the village of Onekama, there's a city park, and there's a fountain there, and right next to the fountain is a Michigan historical marker, and in a lot fewer words than I've done tonight, it tells the story of the cut, and where you're standing at the marker, you can look out across the lake and see the cut.
It's just, I think it's, I did not know that, and then to find out that the thing floated out, what, 3 miles?
2 to 3 miles out into Lake Michigan.
It's just amazing. Can't make that shit up.
Yes.
So how did the farmers do after?
The farmers prospered, and that area became a boon for orchards. So cherries, apples, pears, peaches, blueberries, raspberries, they all abound in that part of the state. And to this day, they still abound. But those little 80-acre homesteads that bring Portage Lake, those are all now residential homes where people have magnificent views of Portage Lake and out towards the cut. I'm getting the, from my timekeeper in the back. So by way of shameless self-promotion, I have all of my books in the back. The one thing I'm proud to announce tonight, and you may have seen this on Facebook, my 4th novel, The Widow and the Warrior. which is set in Frankfort, Michigan, and it deals with the subject of vigilante justice. Just won a gold first place award by the Colorado Independent Publishers Association in their annual Evie Award competition. Thank you. Thank you. And so I have that book with me tonight, but I have all my others. The library here, I was shocked. Jade said they have 9 copies of The Cut. They're all out now.
I just turned mine in.
Good. So there's one back available in the library, and I donated a complete set of all my books again tonight to the library. But I am able to take check, credit card, yes, even cash. The books are $18 a piece, and I'm happy, I'm humbled to sign the book however you would like me to sign it. So with that, and if nobody else has it, if a burning question comes up and you can't leave tonight without answering it, Diane and I will be in the back for a while, so please
I
stop.
just wanted to add that any of our friends that knew Oral that want to come, we're going to have to join some people over at the Griffin afterwards. So you're welcome to come.
John's buying.
This is an old golf buddy of mine. Before we started this event tonight, we were talking about golfers. They have to be slightly mentally. I can guarantee you, in his case, that is 100% true.
I'm proud of it.
Mary.
I gotta tell you, it was so serendipitous because about 3 weeks ago, I'm looking for something to listen to on my phone, and I'm pulling in WMUK, and there's your picture. And I go, that looks like John Wemlinger.
Yeah, Zita Alstairs, right?
You were
Yeah.
interviewed by, what's your name?
Zita Alstairs, yeah. Yeah.
And, oh my God, so that I had gotten booked, and it was wonderful.
That, and I told Zita that this is so gratifying to me as a writer, because my very first book, which was crap, and I didn't realize it was crap, I tried to get WMUK to interview me, and they didn't, because somehow they sniffed out the book was crap. After that book, I got more serious about there's an art to writing fiction. It's a craft. And you just don't sit down at the computer and start banging stuff out. So I went to some writers' conferences. I spent a couple of weeks at the University of Iowa in the summertime. They have a tremendous writing program at the University of Iowa. And I started rubbing elbows with other writers, and I started paying attention to my skills. And the best, 4 of my 5 books have all won awards. But in my view, the most prestigious of them was being named a 2022 Michigan Notable Book by the State Library of Michigan. And that has, it opened the doors of WMUK right up.
John, don't you think that if you would have known at the time that that first book was junk, that you wouldn't have continued? If you would have realized at the time, this is no good, I'm no good, I'm just not going to give it up.
So the interesting part about that is that book, I just let it go. I didn't do anything with it, just let it go. And I published Winter's Bloom, which took me 4 years to write. So that book took 4 years, and that was when I was learning the craft of writing good fiction. And I think still today, Winter's Bloom might be my favorite book.
You got more input from Diane. And the second book.
Yeah,
After the first one.
yeah. That's true. I did have Diane as my editor. Diane is my editor-in-chief on all my books.
Yeah.
But so I had published Winter's Bloom, and I was at dinner with my publisher out of Traverse City. And Doug said to me, "What are you working on next? Because you're only as good as your next project." He keeps me on my toes. And I said, "Well, I've got this idea." And I gave him the idea for Before the Snow Flies. But he said, that first book you wrote, what was the name of it? I said, A Path to Innocence, A Road to War. He said, yeah, that's it. That's a really crappy title. I said, yeah, Doug, I know. And he said, your writing has gotten so much better since then. I think you ought to consider rewriting that book. And so I did. And that was my second book, Operation Light Switch. And that book is much better than its first version, I'm ashamed to say. But every book after that, and should be this way, if you're really trying to make yourself better, each book should be better than the last. And yes, I am working on 6, but it's probably going to be next late spring, early summer before it's out. DB.
Bill was talking about Patterson, right? I think the big reason he uses the typewriter is because typewriters cannot be hacked.
Well, he writes on the legal.
He writes on a
Well, that can't be hacked either,
No.
you know,
Well,
so that's what I was told. So,
Yeah.
a
That could be.
computer hooked up to the internet can be hacked.
Yeah.
A computer not hooked up to the internet can't be hacked.
No.
Yeah.
right, but don't you think he's accessing the internet doing his
Not,
research?
not word, not,
Okay.
not your novel.
Yeah, I mean, I use Microsoft Word, and that's transported to my computer by the internet. Microsoft 365 is